Nolan Pierce was running a morning ground check when he spotted a thin trail of hydraulic fluid beneath the engine nacelle of CEO Sloan Ashcroft's private jet. He climbed aboard to deliver a warning, and Sloan dismissed him before he finished his second sentence. A temporary worker manufacturing importance, she decided, with a board meeting to save. Nolan was already turning to leave when Captain Grant Holloway caught the name on his worn contractor badge. The pilot's face went still. He leaned close to the CEO and lowered his voice. "We need him," because Nolan knew exactly what that aircraft was hiding. Stay with Nolan as he risks everything to expose the man who designed the danger from the ground up. The morning shift at Hawthorne Field's private aviation terminal began the way most of Nolan Pierce's mornings did. Quietly, methodically, and without ceremony. He was 43 years old and had held the contract technician position for 14 months, taking ground assignments that other experienced workers passed over without a second glance, signing no complaints and speaking few unnecessary words, keeping his head below the radar of an industry that had already decided he didn't belong at its upper levels. The Aquila 900 on Pad 7 belonged to Ashcroft Aerodyne Holdings, a sleek twin-engine business jet that Nolan had helped certify years before under a completely different set of circumstances, and as he moved beneath its fuselage with his inspection checklist, he noticed something that stopped him mid-stride. A thin line of blue-violet fluid had traced a path from the equipment bay panel down toward the tarmac, the color unmistakable to anyone who had spent years working with hydraulic and pressurization systems. Not oil, not fuel, but something that had no business being on the exterior of a sealed compartment. He crouched and studied the maintenance seal on the panel door, noticing the tamper wire had been twisted in the wrong direction, the kind of error that only happened when someone had opened the panel and replaced the seal in haste without checking the standard orientation. When he pulled up the aircraft's electronic maintenance record on his tablet and cross-referenced the serial number on the pressure regulation module visible through the inspection gap, the numbers did not match the logged equipment identifier by a single digit. Nolan requested a departure hold through the shift supervisor, explaining the discrepancy in terms that required no exaggeration. A mismatched component serial in a pressurization system was not a conversation to defer, and a seal disturbed after final sign-off was not explainable by normal servicing activity. The supervisor told him the aircraft had already been cleared by Ashcroft's own technical team the previous evening, that the Ashcroft organization maintained its own certified maintenance personnel, and that no contract ground worker had authority to countermand a clearance issued by a registered airframe and power plant technician. Nolan did not argue with the supervisor because arguing with a man who had already decided the answer was a waste of the limited minutes remaining before the aircraft's scheduled departure window closed. He walked up the air stair instead, because the only person whose instruction could delay the flight was the person whose name was on the flight manifest as passenger in command authority. Sloan Ashcroft was standing near the forward bulkhead reviewing documents on a tablet, dressed in the careful precision of someone who had been making an impression in boardrooms since her mid-20s, and the look she turned on Nolan when he appeared in the cabin doorway contained exactly 0 degrees of welcome. She listened to perhaps 40 words of his explanation before a man in a dark security blazer. Rhett Calder, the company's head of protective operations, stepped in front of Nolan and informed him that contract personnel were not authorized to board aircraft without prior clearance. Sloan's expression did not soften as she glanced between them. She had a board session in New York that afternoon, a vote that would determine whether she could prevent the liquidation of her family's aviation division to a fund whose name she didn't fully trust, and she had no patience for a ground worker who had decided this was the moment to manufacture a crisis and attract the kind of attention that might generate a complaint, a payout, or a story. She told Rhett to remove him. Nolan stepped back without resistance, but as he reached the top of the air stair, he turned and addressed Captain Grant Holloway, who had emerged from the cockpit doorway and was watching the exchange with a pilot's instinctive attention to anything unusual in his cabin. Nolan told him not to take the aircraft above 18,000 feet before manually verifying the backup pressurization controller. Not a request, not a threat, just a single flat sentence delivered with the calm of a man who had already decided he'd done what he could do. Grant's eyes dropped to the contractor badge on Nolan's chest, and the older man's expression shifted in a way that was barely visible but entirely unmistakable to anyone paying attention. The name on the badge read N. Pierce, and Grant Holloway had spent 2 years studying emergency procedure protocols written by an engineer named Nolan Pierce, the same engineer who had designed the redundant control switchover sequence for the Aquila 900 series. Grant looked at Sloan. He said it quietly, with the weight of someone who chose words the way he chose altitudes, carefully, and only when they mattered. We need him. The cabin went still for a moment that felt longer than it was. Then Nolan glanced past Grant toward the cockpit display panel, and what he saw there made the stillness mean something different than it had a second before. The navigation computer was showing a maintenance uplink command in its queue, logged as received and pending execution, even though every external access panel on the aircraft had been sealed for departure, and no technician had been within range of the aircraft's data port for the past 30 minutes. Grant Holloway did not need to explain his reasoning twice. He stepped back into the cockpit and suspended the departure sequence, citing an open maintenance inquiry that required resolution before any runway clearance could be issued, which was his right as pilot in command, and not something Sloan Ashcroft could override regardless of how hard the departure window was pressing against her schedule. She followed him forward and stood in the cockpit doorway with her arms crossed, her expression calibrated to the precise temperature that had historically made subordinates accelerate their timelines, and Grant, who had flown for the Ashcroft family for 11 years, simply pointed to the seat behind the co-pilot station and asked Nolan to sit down. Nolan worked through the navigation and systems computer without asking for permission or offering a running commentary. The primary display reported all parameters within normal operating range, which was exactly what he expected, because the kind of interference he was looking for was not designed to be visible through the normal reporting layer. What he found was in the maintenance log underneath. A 47-second gap immediately following the receipt of the uplink command, a silence in the data record that did not correspond to any legitimate maintenance function, followed by a quiet background process that had established a communication channel with a server registered to Ashcroft's central maintenance hub. He didn't touch the primary system. He pulled up the backup control interface instead, the redundant architecture that he himself had helped specify years before, and ran a manual verification of its independent operation. The backup was clean. Sloan asked him directly why a contract ground technician understood her aircraft's systems architecture better than the certified specialists on her company's payroll. Her tone was not hostile in the way that Rhett's had been. It was the measured, slightly chilled inquisitiveness of a woman who had learned that when something didn't add up, the most useful question was the simplest one. Grant answered before Nolan could, telling her that the technician standing in her cockpit was formerly a senior certification engineer at Ashcroft Aerodyne, one of the original design verification team members for the aircraft they were sitting in. The silence that followed had texture in it. Rhett produced a document on his phone shortly afterward, a termination record from the Ashcroft Aerodyne personnel files dated 5 years earlier, listing the cause of separation as unauthorized access to flight data systems. He placed it where Sloan could see it and watched her face process the implication. A man with a grudge, a sophisticated understanding of the aircraft's vulnerable architecture, and a history of accessing systems without authorization. Nolan didn't look at the document. He told Sloan she could review his personnel history once she was confident the aircraft was airworthy, and that if she wanted him gone afterward, he would leave without argument. Grant completed the verification sequence on the backup controller and confirmed it was fully operational and certified for primary use. He told Sloan the aircraft could depart safely if flown on the backup system, with the compromised navigation computer isolated from the control network. He also told her, with the specific economy of a man who had survived multiple in-flight emergencies by trusting competence over title, that he would not take the aircraft past the departure threshold unless Nolan was aboard to monitor the systems in real time. Sloan looked at Nolan for a long moment, and the calculation happening behind her eyes was visible even if its contents were not. She said she needed to know whether this was about the aircraft or about the company that had terminated him. He told her he wasn't interested in negotiating. "I want you to stop treating every warning like the opening of a transaction." She assigned him the technical observer seat at the aft end of the cabin. Grant filed a revised departure manifest. The engine spooled, and as the Aquila 900 rolled forward onto the taxiway, every display in the cockpit populated correctly, except the navigation destination, which had quietly updated itself to a location called Harrow Ridge that no one on the aircraft had entered, requested, or approved. Grant cleared Harrow Ridge from the destination field before the aircraft reached the runway hold short line, overriding it with their original routing to Westchester County Airport outside New York. And by the time they lifted off the field, it had returned. Same identifier, same coordinates, same quiet certainty in the display, as though the system considered the correction an inconvenience rather than an instruction. Nolan, working from the technical station in the cabin, identified the mechanism within the first 8 minutes of flight. A background process embedded below the standard operating layer of the navigation computer, dormant under 18,000 feet and waiting, the kind of code that didn't announce itself in checksums or pre-flight diagnostics, because it had been written by someone who understood exactly where the diagnostic processes looked and where they didn't. He asked Grant to hold their altitude below 14,000 feet. The region ahead, however, was building weather, a band of moderate convective turbulence that the meteorological overlay was painting in amber, not severe but uncomfortable enough that staying beneath it meant a rougher ride and extended flight time, neither of which Sloan's board meeting schedule could easily absorb. Grant made the judgment call that his professional training required increase their altitude, and at 18,040 feet the navigation system did exactly what Nolan had told them it would do. The primary flight computer attempted to assert authority over the backup controller, not violently, but persistently, the way a current of water pushes against a closed valve, steady, patient, and building. The autopilot began introducing heading corrections that accumulated toward a northwest bearing, small adjustments that would have been invisible to anyone not specifically watching for them, each one individually within normal parameters and collectively redirecting the aircraft toward Harrow Ridge at a rate that would have brought them within range of the alternate airfield within 40 minutes. Nolan talked Grant through 3 specific actions in sequence: isolating the satellite data uplink that was sustaining the background process, switching primary flight authority fully to the backup controller, and physically disconnecting the network bridge between the compromised navigation computer and the flight control bus. Grant executed each step, Nolan did not touch the control systems himself, maintaining the discipline of a man who understood the line between advising a pilot and replacing one. Sloane had remained in her seat through the maneuvering with the stillness of someone working very hard to look composed, and, when the aircraft steadied and the heading locked back to their original course, she asked Nolan, without preamble, whether she was looking at a system malfunction or something deliberate. He told her what the data showed. The code required specific knowledge of the Aquila 900's architecture. It had been installed through a legitimate maintenance access channel using valid credentials, and its behavior was too precisely calibrated to be the product of an accident. She absorbed that and took out her phone to call the Ashcroft Operations Center. Everett Langford, her chief operating officer, answered with the measured concern of a man who had been anticipating the call. He told her the backup controller was an unverified workaround, that the prudent course was to follow the navigation system's routing guidance and land at Harrow Ridge for a proper technical inspection by qualified personnel. Sloane listened. She said very little. But Nolan, watching from the aft station, noticed that Everett had named Harrow Ridge unprompted, before Sloane had mentioned the destination she'd seen on the display, and he set his phone quietly to record the remaining 30 seconds of the call without drawing attention to the movement. Grant announced a diversion to Bryer County Municipal Airport, a regional field that had no contractual or operational relationship with Ashcroft Aerodyne, and brought the aircraft down on a clean backup controller approach that was textbook in its precision. The wheels touched. The aircraft rolled to a stop on a narrow taxiway apron beside a single open hangar. They had been on the ground for 12 minutes when the first of 3 vehicles rolled through the perimeter gate. Dark SUVs moving with the unhurried confidence of people who had known exactly where to find them. Rhett Calder stepped out of the lead vehicle before it had fully stopped, his jacket straightened against the late morning wind, and told Sloane that he had mobilized the moment the aircraft deviated from its filed route, that his responsibility was her safety above all logistical concerns, and that his team was prepared to secure the aircraft and ensure she reached New York by alternate means. His manner was impeccable, solicitous, urgent, precisely calibrated to sound like loyalty. Nolan asked him, from the top of the air stair, how he knew which airport to come to. Rhett said the aircraft's emergency position system had transmitted their coordinates automatically during the altitude event. Grant stated flatly, from the cockpit doorway, that Nolan had isolated the position transmitter as part of the uplink shutdown before the diversion, and that no automatic transmission had been sent. The silence that followed was brief but sufficient. Sloane looked at the vehicles assembled at the perimeter, 3 of them, with a total of 8 personnel, arriving within 12 minutes of touchdown at an airport that had not been in anyone's filed plan. She looked at the markings on the vehicle's door panels, which did not carry the Ashcroft Aerodyne Security Division emblem she was accustomed to, but instead a corporate identifier she recognized after a moment as belonging to a logistics subsidiary based out of Harrow Ridge. Rhett told her the vehicles had been dispatched from the nearest available resource, given the urgency of the situation. Sloane said she understood and asked him to give her a few minutes with Captain Holloway before they proceeded. Rhett wanted Nolan's equipment and his phone. Nolan told him politely that he would need to produce documentation authorizing that request. Rhett produced nothing. He detailed 2 of his personnel to stay near the air stair and walked back toward the vehicles, placing a call on his own phone that he kept angled away from the group on the aircraft. Grant locked the cockpit and stayed with the flight data recorder. Nolan guided Sloane through the aircraft's aft service exit, which opened to the fuel vehicle access lane behind the hangar, and they crossed to a disused operations office on the far side of the field using a battery-powered ground service cart, moving without urgency because hurrying attracted attention, and the distance was short enough not to require it. The office had power, a landline, and a Wi-Fi connection that was not routed through any Ashcroft network infrastructure. Sloan called Everett from a number he wouldn't immediately associate with her, identified herself, and described the situation in terms that withheld any mention of their precise location. He expressed appropriate concern and asked twice, then a third time, exactly where Nolan was and what data, if any, he had been able to extract from the aircraft's systems. She gave him nothing. She thanked him and ended the call. Mara Quinn, Ashcroft's general counsel, reached out 14 minutes later with information she had pulled from the board's communications channel. A formal incident report had been filed and distributed to every board member within the past hour, alleging that the CEO had pressured her flight crew to depart against an active safety flag, and that the resulting in-flight emergency had been exacerbated by an unauthorized intervention from a terminated former employee with documented cause for hostility toward the company. The report was detailed, internally consistent, and sourced to 2 separate internal accounts. It had arrived too quickly to have been drafted in response to actual events. Sloan looked at Nolan across the cluttered surface of the disused operations desk. She said his history was the problem, that anyone trying to undermine her credibility had been handed exactly the character they needed, a former employee with access and motive, showing up on the one day when everything was already in motion. Nolan said his history existed because her company had chosen to construct it rather than investigate the underlying report, and that if she was going to be angry at someone, she should find the person whose decision that had actually been. Mara sent a second message seconds later. It contained a scanned copy of Nolan's termination order, timestamped 5 years ago, with every required signature in sequence. The final one, at the bottom of the last page, read Sloan Ashcroft. Sloan looked at the document for a longer time than she spent on most documents. She was a woman who processed information quickly and made decisions from positions of clarity, and the clarity she was arriving at in that moment was not comfortable. She told Nolan she did not remember signing the order, that she executed hundreds of personnel actions in any given month based on materials prepared by her HR and legal teams, and that she had no specific memory of reviewing the underlying case. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said that was the part that had stayed with him the longest, not the dismissal, not the lawyers, not the 5 years of watching a career he'd built from the ground up sit in a drawer, but the plain fact that the decision that had changed the trajectory of his entire adult life had been made by someone who couldn't remember making it. He told her what had actually happened. 5 years ago, working within the Ashcroft Aerodyne Certification Division, he had identified a pressure regulation module from a supplier called North Star Vector Components, whose manufacturing records didn't match its performance specifications and whose serial data indicated batch substitution, the marks of a component that had been certified under one standard and manufactured under another. He had submitted a formal engineering review with supporting documentation, cross-referenced to 14 separate units already installed across the fleet. Within a week, the documentation he had submitted had been replaced in the internal system by a revised report that omitted the technical evidence, attributed the serial discrepancies to a logging error, and recommended no further action. He had not written that revision. He had attempted to escalate directly to the senior leadership team and had been referred back to his own supervisor. 2 days later, his building access was revoked, his system credentials were suspended, and he had received written notice that his continued employment had been terminated for unauthorized access to restricted flight data systems. The specific action being the comparison of internal component records against external certification databases, which was precisely the work his position required. His wife had been managing a chronic illness that required ongoing treatment and close monitoring, and Avery was 14 years old. He had no mechanism to fight a corporate legal team of 30 attorneys, while also maintaining the insurance coverage and financial stability that both of them depended on. He had made the calculation that a person makes when they understand that two things they cannot afford to lose are placed on opposite sides of a scale, and he had chosen the one that could not wait. He walked away from the legal fight. He did not walk away from knowing what he had found. Sloan pulled up both versions of the original report on Mara's shared screen, the version she had been shown at the time of the termination action, and the version Mara had now located in an archived backup partition of the engineering documentation server. They were formatted identically. The later version was missing 9 pages of supporting technical analysis, 3 appendices, and the specific language linking North Star Vector to a pattern of batch substitution across multiple clients. Mara, working the document metadata, found that the last editor before submission to the executive review file was a user account, registered to an administrative assistant who had reported directly to Everett Langford. Sloan looked at Nolan. She said she was sorry. He held her gaze for a moment and then looked at the wall. He told her that an apology only carried weight if the person offering it was prepared to let the truth be public regardless of what it cost the institution, not simply acknowledge it privately once the institution was already under threat. Mara interrupted them to report that the board's emergency session was now formally scheduled, that the agenda included a vote on interim executive authority, and that if Sloan was absent or deemed incapacitated, Everett Langford would be designated acting CEO with immediate authority to authorize transactions pending board review. The time remaining before the session opened was measured in hours, not days. Nolan leaned back and thought about a technical feature he had helped design into the Aquila 900 during the certification process. A separate data retention architecture that operated on an isolated circuit, one that he had included precisely because he had already started to distrust the integrity of the standard reporting layer. It was an independent system he had internally named the Audit Vault, which logged every maintenance command issued to the aircraft and could not be erased or overwritten by any remote administrative access. Only the engineers who had built it knew it existed. Everett had forced Nolan out of the company 5 years ago and had never known he was removing the one person who could access what the vault contained. "There's something still in that aircraft," Nolan said, "that the person who did this doesn't know is there." Grant called before Sloan could respond. He said Rhett's team had opened the aircraft's forward avionics bay and were preparing to remove the primary navigation computer. If the navigation computer left the airport in the back of a Harrow Ridge vehicle, every command embedded in its systems would be under the physical control of the people who had placed those commands there, and no chain of custody would ever satisfy a regulatory investigator. Nolan laid this out in 4 sentences because there was no time for more, and Sloan understood it before he finished. She called the airport's operations manager directly, identifying herself as the registered owner of the aircraft and invoking the legal right to restrict movement of any company asset pending a formal safety inquiry, which was a legitimate authority that a small regional airport manager had no reasonable grounds to contest. The operations manager informed Rhett's team that no vehicle or equipment associated with the aircraft could depart the airport property until documentation was provided. Rhett produced paperwork within minutes. A formal corporate authorization order bearing Sloan's printed name and an executive authority reference that appeared valid at first reading. Mara examined it remotely and filed an emergency procedural challenge through the State Aviation Registry within 11 minutes, questioning the underlying authorization and requesting a 48-hour hold on asset transfer pending verification. Not a final win, but a legal friction sufficient to buy time. Nolan and Sloan moved back through the airport's service corridor system, staying away from the main terminal, and found Grant still in the cockpit doorway using the only tool available to him: the refusal to sign the equipment transfer manifest. He had told the technician attempting to remove the computer that he would not certify the removal without a complete written handover, had asked for credentials 3 times, and had found a procedural objection for each answer he received. A delaying action sustained by nothing but a 60-year-old pilot's comprehensive knowledge of aviation transfer protocol. Nolan asked him to hold 2 more minutes. The hangar's fire suppression test switch was in the maintenance utility room adjacent to the avionics access corridor, a monthly test activation that would trigger the alert system in the forward equipment bay, routing everyone not directly involved in fire response away from the area for the 30 seconds the all-clear verification required. He activated it. The alert tone sounded. RET's personnel moved back to the designated muster position. Nolan retrieved the navigation computer from the forward bay in the time it takes to replace 1 mounting bracket, and the audit vault's access module was intact. The audit vault required a cryptographic authentication sequence that had been assigned to the original certification team. Not a password in the conventional sense, but a mechanical input protocol performed on a specific sequence of switches on the maintenance panel in a specific order. A physical access method chosen precisely because it could not be transmitted, intercepted, or compromised through a digital channel. Nolan's digital credentials had been revoked on the day of his termination. His knowledge of the physical sequence had not been revoked, because no one in the company's security division had known it existed. He worked through the sequence. Sloan stood in the hangar doorway watching the perimeter. While his hands were still on the panel, Nolan called Avery, keeping the conversation short, telling her that his name was about to be in front of a lot of people, and that not all of what they heard would be the version he would have chosen to present. Avery's response was immediate, and without hesitation. She had been waiting for years for anyone to hear her father's side of the story, and she was not concerned about what the first version said because she already knew what the last version would be. Nolan finished the input sequence. The system ran its verification check. The audit vault opened. The first lines of data populated across the screen in a format he recognized immediately: maintenance command logs, time-stamped, source identified, and cryptographically signed by the device that had issued each instruction. He read the first entry. Then he read the account identifier attached to it, the command that had initiated the sabotage of Sloan Ashcroft's aircraft had been sent under a user account bearing the name Sloan Ashcroft. Sloan looked at her own name on the screen with an expression that moved through disbelief and settled into something colder and more focused. She told Nolan she had not issued any maintenance command to the aircraft in the past week, which was not information she had to defend. He already knew it, because the timestamp on the entry placed the command at 2:47 in the afternoon on a Tuesday, a time that he immediately asked her to cross-reference against her own calendar. She pulled it up. At 2:47 on that Tuesday, she had been standing at a podium at the Meridian Aviation Forum in Atlanta, visible to 400 attendees and recorded on the event's official video documentation. She had been physically incapable of issuing the command at the moment the log said she had. The audit vault contained 2 additional data points that standard logging had not preserved. The first was the hardware identifier of the device used to authenticate the command, a specific machine code that corresponded to a corporate workstation, not a mobile device or remote terminal. The second was the network origin of the authentication request, a subnet address that mapped precisely to the Ashcroft Aerodyne Operations Tower on the company's headquarters campus. Nolan cross-referenced the hardware identifier against the company's asset registry, which Mara had access to through the corporate document system. The asset tag returned a single entry, a workstation assigned to the office of the Chief Operating Officer. Mara, working simultaneously from the legal files, located the original vendor contract between Ashcroft Aerodyne and Northstar Vector Components, a document that should have been a standard supply chain agreement, but was instead structured through a holding company whose registered ownership traced through two intermediary entities to a private equity fund. The same fund, carrying the same management team that had been approaching the Ashcroft board about acquiring the aviation division. Everett had constructed a supply chain that paid below standard component pricing to a manufacturer he effectively controlled through the fund structure, billed Ashcroft the full certified rate for the parts, pocketed the margin through the holding company, and was now preparing to sell the aviation division to himself, completing the transaction before any audit could surface the component fraud. The sabotage of the aircraft had not been designed to harm Sloan physically. It had been designed to divert her, delay her, remove her from the board session, and give Everett the window he needed to vote through the sale under temporary executive authority. Sloan wanted to transmit the data immediately to the Federal Aviation Administration and the appropriate financial regulators. Nolan told her the files as currently extracted were unverified copies retrieved under emergency conditions by a man whose personnel file described him as a bad actor. Any competent defense attorney would question the chain of custody and argue that he had created or altered the records. What they needed was a new command logged in real time, with a provable source, in a controlled environment that no one could credibly claim had been fabricated. He proposed using the aircraft as a lure, announced to Everett that the audit vault had not yet been fully accessed, imply that the technical barriers were still in place, and wait for him to attempt a final remote erasure before federal investigators reached the system. They would route the aircraft's network connection through a simulation environment that would accept and log the command without permitting it to reach the actual hardware. Grant confirmed the simulation architecture was technically feasible within the equipment available at the airport and asked only one condition. Nothing in the plan was to place any member of the flight crew or any passenger in physical danger. Nolan agreed without hesitation. The aircraft stayed on the ground. Sloan told Nolan while they waited for the technical setup to complete that she had spent the past few hours revising her assessment of what kind of man he was. She said she had initially categorized him as someone operating from grievance, and that she now understood he had lost his professional life defending people who had boarded his certified aircraft without ever knowing his name. He looked at the hangar floor for a moment. He said it had seemed like the obvious thing to do at the time. Grant walked back in to report that Everett Langford had gone before the board. The emergency session convened remotely with 11 board members present on screen, the kind of fast-assembled governance process that organizations reach for when the news is moving faster than their procedures. Everett addressed them with the quiet authority of a man who had spent decades building credibility in exactly this room. He described a CEO who had overridden a safety flag to meet a personal deadline, a pilot whose judgment had been compromised by divided loyalties, and a terminated former employee with a documented history of unauthorized system access, who had used a moment of manufactured crisis to insert himself back into the company's most sensitive technical infrastructure. He delivered each point in the precise sequence of a professional who had organized them in advance. Sloan joined the session from the hangar, her camera framing her against the corrugated metal wall, and the aircraft visible in the background, a composition that was not polished and not designed to be. She did not lead with the evidence. She told the board that she had made an error earlier that morning in dismissing a safety observation from a qualified technician because she was behind schedule, and that the consequences of that error, while ultimately contained, had confirmed for her that she had been running a company where the pressure to perform had begun to override the discipline to listen. The honesty arrested the surgeon. Several board members had been nodding along with Everett's narrative and stopped. Sloan told them she also had evidence that the incident had not been an accident. Mara placed both versions of Nolan's termination file on the board's shared document screen. The version Sloan had reviewed at the time, and the unaltered original recovered from the archived backup. Everett stated that the original file had been created by Nolan himself at some point during the intervening years, fabricated to support a wrongful termination narrative he had been unable to pursue through legitimate legal channels. Nolan did not contest the claim verbally. He offered instead to conduct a live diagnostic verification. Connect the aircraft's system to the Ashcroft Operations Network. Invite Everett to issue a single benign diagnostic command through the standard maintenance interface, and allow the audit vault to confirm the source and routing of that command in real time, before the entire board, under conditions that no one could argue had been manufactured in advance. Everett declined. He said the exercise risked corrupting the evidentiary integrity of systems already under legal question, that any data produced in such conditions would be inadmissible, and that the board's responsibility was to act on the documented record rather than a live demonstration orchestrated by a man with a personal interest in its outcome. Some of the board appeared persuaded. Others did not. Sloan told the board that the audit vault's recovery process would complete automatically within 10 minutes, and that no further action was required from her team, framing it as an update, casual and factual, designed to sound like information being shared with allies rather than bait being extended toward a target. Everett said he needed to step away briefly to consult with the company's external legal team and would return before the vote. He left the screen. The session paused. Nolan watched the simulation environment's input monitor. Rhett Calder arrived at the hangar with 4 additional personnel, presenting a formal asset recovery order, a document that, unlike the earlier paperwork, was properly formatted and traced to an authorization level that Mara said was legitimate on its face. The operations manager was no longer in a position to simply refuse. Sloan told Rhett he had been formally suspended from his duties, effective the previous hour, and that anyone acting under his instructions would be acting without valid corporate authority. Rhett told her that her own authority was the subject of the pending board vote, and that, in the interval, the documented chain of operational command supported his position. The hangar filled with the specific tension of people holding very still while deciding whether the next move would be theirs. Then the simulation monitor showed a countdown. A remote erasure command had been initiated from an endpoint at the Ashcroft headquarters campus, scheduled to execute in 40 seconds. Nolan did not intercept the command. He watched it travel through the simulation routing, authenticated, packaged, transmitted with the confidence of someone who believed they were reaching the actual system, and the audit vault recorded each of its attributes in sequence. The initiation timestamp, the hardware identifier of the originating device, the authentication token used to validate the sender's identity, and the subnet address resolving to an office in the operations tower of the Ashcroft Aerodyne headquarters building. The account used to authenticate the erasure command was the same false credential bearing Sloan Ashcroft's name. The hardware identifier was identical to the workstation logged in the original sabotage entry. The erasure command had been sent from Everett Langford's office while he was supposed to be consulting with external legal counsel. Mara published the captured data directly to the board's shared document session before Everett had returned to his screen. The information populated in real time, time-stamped, source verified, and cryptographically signed by the Audit Vault's own authentication protocol, which had been designed specifically to produce records that could not be altered without invalidating the signature. Everett rejoined the session 40 seconds later and expressed visible confusion at the documents appearing on screen, a performance that required him to hold his expression at a particular angle he had not quite prepared for. Nolan asked him to display the last application open on the tablet he was currently holding. Everett said he was a contract technician without standing to make requests in a board session. Sloan asked him the same question. Grant connected the board session's audio to the recording he had made aboard the aircraft. The phone conversation between Sloan and Everett during the in-flight emergency, the segment in which Everett had named Harrow Ridge as the recommended landing destination before Sloan had mentioned the airport's identity, demonstrating knowledge of the aircraft's intended diversion point that he could only have possessed if he had designed it. Several board members began speaking simultaneously. Sloan brought the session to order and placed the vendor contracts connecting Northstar Vector components to the private equity fund on the board's shared screen, identifying the management overlap by name and entity registration date. Rhett, standing in the hangar, received a call that lasted approximately 15 seconds. When it ended, the change in his posture was visible. He had understood what Nolan had already understood several minutes earlier. Everett was preparing to position him as the operational executor of a plan whose architecture Everett would deny having designed, and the choice available to Rhett was between being the documented instrument of someone else's fraud or being the person whose testimony established who had actually given the instructions. He made the decision that people in his position most often make when they fully understand the alternative. He held out his phone to Sloan and told her it contained a message chain and an instruction log from Everett Langford, covering a 14-month period. Sloan accepted it and passed it directly to Mara. Federal aviation investigators and 2 agents from the Financial Crimes Division of the relevant federal oversight body had been en route to Bryan County Municipal Airport for the past 40 minutes, notified by a request Mara had filed through an emergency regulatory contact earlier that afternoon. They arrived and took custody of the navigation computer, the simulation logs, the audit vault extraction, and Rhett's phone. Everett was removed from the active board session and his system access was suspended by the board's independent security administrator before he could close his applications. 3 board members moved immediately for a formal censure and investigation. Everett told the remaining board members, in his last statement before the session was suspended, that Sloan was placing the future of a multi-billion-dollar institution in the hands of a man who had been terminated for cause and had never held an executive credential in his life. Sloan said, "I'm placing it in the hands of the one person who told us the truth before it was too late." Grant, watching from the cockpit entrance, repeated the words he had said that morning in the cabin, not loudly, not for anyone beyond the hangar. That's why we needed him. The weeks that followed moved through official channels in the way that corporate fraud investigations do, methodically, with a great deal of documentation and a great deal of waiting, but with a direction that became clearer as each layer of Northstar Vector's contract structure was unwound and each Harrow Ridge vehicle receipt was traced back to its authorizing signature. Everett Langford was indicted on charges spanning procurement fraud, falsification of aviation safety records, unauthorized manipulation of flight control systems, and breach of fiduciary duty. Rhett Calder entered a cooperation agreement and provided testimony that corroborated the documentary evidence and extended the case to 3 additional individuals within the supply chain. The pending sale of Ashcroft Aerodyne's aviation division was formally withdrawn, and the company issued a public notice initiating the recall of every Northstar Vector component installed across its fleet. An announcement that included an acknowledgement that an internal safety report raising these exact concerns had been suppressed 5 years earlier, and that the engineer who had filed it had been wrongfully separated from his position. Nolan Pierce received a formal reversal of his termination and a financial settlement that covered the years of income differential between the contract work he had accepted and the position he had held. 4 other engineers who had left the company during the same period under similar pressure were contacted individually. Sloan stood in front of the company's workforce and the industry press and said, without qualification, that the organization had been built to reward speed and authority over honesty, and that the failure was structural, and she accepted responsibility for it. She did not soften the language. She did not offer the kind of conditional acknowledgement that allows institutions to technically apologize without actually admitting fault. She offered Nolan the position of Vice President of Flight Safety. He accepted it with 3 conditions. The safety division would report independently to the full board, not through any executive chain. No member of company leadership, including the CEO, could alter or redact the findings of a safety review, and any certified technician on any Ashcroft aircraft had the standing authority to delay departure pending investigation, without requiring managerial approval and without consequence to their employment. Sloan agreed to all 3 in writing before he signed anything. Avery came to the Hawthorne Field hangar on a Saturday in November, and Nolan watched her cross the floor to the far wall where the original Aquila 900 certification plaque had been remounted with all team names restored. She stood in front of it for a while without speaking. He stood beside her and didn't try to fill the silence. The first time Sloan came to the airport for a departure inspection under the new protocols, she found Nolan in the middle of a system check and waited without a word until he was finished. He told her he needed 10 more minutes. She sat down on a maintenance step and waited without complaint, without instruction, without the impatient calculation she had worn that first morning on pad 7. When he finally turned around, she asked if he wanted to ride along to New York. He said yes. Before she stepped aboard, she looked over her shoulder at him and said, "You know I could still order you off this aircraft." He said, "And you know the captain will tell you we need me." Grant Holloway heard it from the open cockpit window. He said nothing, just nodded once, the slow, deliberate nod of a man who had known, from the moment he read a name on a worn contractor badge, that this was always going to be how the story ended. This time, Sloan stepped to one side and let Nolan board the jet first.